Fear. Fear. We are built to feel fear. We have many physiological responses to fear. We stop breathing, or just our diaphragm gets frozen and we're taking no air in. We have a gripping pain in our gut. The blood rushes from our extremities to our organs. Try making it through a piano recital with ice-cold hands, as I did throughout my entire adolescence. You cannot play Bach with ice-cold hands, trust me. Fear dominates our lives in many ways, and it's funny because many of those things that we are, the physiological responses that we have are built into this body created by God. But there's the good fear, the bad fear, and the ugly fear, with apologies to Sergio Leone and my mother's favorite Western, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. So, I do want to, before I launch into what's wrong with fear, there's some good things about fear, all those responses that I just talked about, and even fearful thoughts in our head. So, for example, when I'm riding my bike through Scripps Ranch and I've just climbed up a 10% hill, and then I get to glide down Scripps Lake Drive. And on my bike, it's 26 miles an hour on my computer, then 28 miles an hour, and then 30 miles an hour, and then I'm flying over potholes, and there's a red light coming up, and my voice, my body says, too fast! How are you going to stop? And you'll die if you hit another pothole. So that's what I call fear creating the voice of caution in us. Or a teenager is driving along, texting a friend while driving, and nearly hits the car in front of him, and they clench up in fear because their parents have told them at least 150 times, do not text while driving. I guarantee the teens of Scripps Ranch are all doing it. I'm watching them do it while they drive. That fear is good. That's caution. It creates caution. Don't be foolish. And there are other types of fears we might consider wise. So, for example, we're heading into a drought and it's hot, and I'm sure people have some concerns, some worries, maybe even fear about wildfires coming. And so you get out the suitcase and you repack your go bag with any necessaries you might need if you need to flee your home. Just prudence, caution. That's not a bad fear. I don't think that's the fear the Bible is talking about. And the Bible talks about fear a lot, 679 times to be exact. The word fear or afraid shows up. From Genesis chapter 3, when Adam was afraid that God was going to see him naked, to the book of Revelation, where terror is brought upon the earth by the horsemen of the apocalypse. Fear. And the most common command in the Bible is not love God and love your neighbor. The most common, the most repeated command is do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Most common one. That's because the writers of the Bible, the messengers sent by God in the form of angels who were saying do not be afraid, they had psychological wisdom that preceded our 19th century understanding of our mind and how it generates fear unnecessarily. That's why they kept commanding from millennia ago, do not be afraid, because they recognize how it takes over our minds. So let's talk about bad fear. The fear that Jesus is talking about when he says, why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith in me? That's the kind of fear we're talking about. Now, some people think that the Bible engenders fear of God because we're supposed to fear God. So let's think about that for a moment. You notice that in our psalm it refers to put the fear of God in them. God, put fear in these people so that they will believe in you. Well, usually we understand that we as Christians have a sense of reverence and awe for God. But for many people, this turns into fear of displeasing God, fear of sinning, and thus making God angry at us. It's a very parental notion. I'll do something wrong and then he'll get mad at me. However, that comes from bad theology. I'm just going to say it for all the EFM graduates here. Bad theology, that is the belief that we could live a life in such a way as to be always pleasing to God. If I'm good, God will never be displeased. I'm here to tell you that it's a fundamental tenet, foundation of our belief that we can never live a life totally pleasing to God, not even for one day. Thus, Jesus, right? That is his message to us. Do not worry about sinning. Believe in me. That is all that is required. Believe in me, that I am in the storm with you. Trust in me. It's not about not displeasing God. We are displeasing God. Don't even know we're doing it sometimes. It's about trusting in God. That's what Jesus is talking about. So one of the best writers on this subject is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was the 20th century German pastor and theologian. And he delivered a speech on fear in 1933, which is when Hitler and the SS had come into power. They had not only taken over the government, but they were taking over the German church. They managed to get in a bunch of Nazi pastors so that any changes he wanted to the church would pass in their, whatever were their diocesan conventions that they had in the German church. He fought this along with another great theologian, Karl Barth. He fought it as much as he could. He'd go on the radio airwaves and they'd cut him off before he could say much more against Hitler. He left Germany in 1933, went to England to try to stir up sort of a German resistance from England against Hitler. And Karl Barth, the other great anti-Nazi theologian of the 20th century, told him he was a coward, that he needed to come back and fight with his people. So he came back and he preached about fear. And he said that fear is the great arch enemy. He also believed that it came from the enemy, that is the anti-God energy of the world. That fear would paralyze people who saw evil in their midst and would do nothing about it. They saw Jews being tortured and round up and sent to concentration camps and ghettos, and they were doing nothing about it because they were afraid. They were afraid of what would happen to them if they protected Jews, because they were afraid. And he preached against that fear. He left Germany again in 1938 because all of his buddies at Union Theological Seminary in New York City said, "Get out of Germany, they're going to kill you." And so he came to New York for exactly 2 weeks, because it took only 2 weeks for his conscience to say, "What are you doing? Why are you letting fear drive you away from the evil that God has sent you to fight?" And so he went back to what we called the Confessing Church of Germany, that is the church that was attempting to resist Nazism and all of its evils. And, as many of you know from his history, he joined a resistance group whose goal was to assassinate Adolf Hitler to end the regime that was wreaking havoc in Europe. And for that, he, his brother, and his 2 brothers-in-law were jailed and eventually executed by the Nazis, in his case, right before the end of World War II in April of 1945. He confronted that fear, and he talked about all the fears we have that we've all suffered: fear of dying ourselves, fear of a loved one dying, fear of our child doing something foolish or dangerous or getting in trouble, fear of the wildfire, the earthquake, the hurricane, fear of not having enough long-term care insurance, fear of not having enough money to retire with, fear of not getting a job, fear, 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 fear. And he said, this is the archenemy of our life. So, Jesus asked the question in the boat, "Why are you afraid?" He doesn't say there's nothing to be afraid of. Of course, a storm that is sending waves over the side of the boat so that the boat is nearly swamped, of course that's dangerous. Of course it's worrisome. And we have survival instincts implanted by God to get that water out of the boat and to get out of the water if you can. Nothing wrong about that. Jesus says, "Why are you afraid?" when your Savior is lying in the boat, sleeping through it, not worried at all. That's why he asks, "Why are you afraid?" Not because there's no storm. He gets that. What he doesn't get is why, after you've seen all the miracles I have performed for you, have you heard all the wisdom I've taught you, why do you have no faith? Do you really think this boat is going to be overturned with us in it? That's what Jesus was getting at. That's what Dietrich Bonhoeffer was getting at. It's not that there's nothing to be afraid of. Of course, wildfires are a thing to be concerned about. Of course, it would be nice to be able to take care of ourselves in retirement. But when it paralyzes us, when it keeps us from doing anything else with our thoughts or our resources of our time, then it has become the arch enemy that takes over our lives. Now I want to talk about ugly fear, because that's what Bonhoeffer was getting at. The bad fear turns into the ugly fear when you refuse to do anything to protect perfectly innocent people who are being attacked by evil. Think of the word homophobia. Homophobia. It is the term used to describe discrimination against, acts of violence or hatred towards LGBTQ people, and yet it is talking about fear. Phobia is fear. Fear of homosexuality. What is to the fear? Is it contagious? Will they take over the world? The birth rate will disappear? Is that really going to happen? What is there to fear? Now, some religious people might say, God says it's wrong, therefore if we condone homosexuality in any way, we will be bad people and God will somehow rain bad things upon us. Once again, bad theology. Because did God say, go find the sinners and discriminate against them and hurt them? No. God invited them to dinner. And I'm not saying that homosexuality actually is. I'm just in the mindset of those people. If you actually think that about them, why aren't you inviting them to dinner as Jesus did? I think that fear is the second root of racism in the United States. The first being, I believe, greed. How do I get labor for free? Let's create a subclass to build the United States to farm our farms. And I can't get rid of slaves because then I'll be poor because I have to pay my labor force. But fear is the second root of racism in our country. And we are celebrating Juneteenth as a nation, finally, as a national holiday. It is the anniversary of June 19th, 1865, when the Union Army made it all the way to Texas and announced to enslaved black Texans that they were free, that they could leave their masters, their owners. Now, African Americans have been celebrating this in the United States since 1865. A lot of white Americans hadn't heard of it until 3 days ago, right? What's Juneteenth? But that's because a lot of black people were afraid for many decades, hundreds of years in this country, about celebrating something that would be perceived as subversive. But for them, they had their own national anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing, the Black National Anthem, because it tells a different story than the Star Spangled Banner or America the Beautiful. It has a different sense to it, and it is a hymn that is basically saying no matter what is happening to us, God is with us in the storm, and we will make it someday, somehow. That is what Lift Every Voice and Sing says. It doesn't say, we have triumphed over the British, or we have a great country with brotherhood. Very different theme. Very different. And what are people who are outwardly racist afraid of, or even inwardly racist, or not even aware they're racist? They're afraid of losing power, afraid of losing wealth, their child's place at the University of Texas, the job, those jobs that seemingly go to other races, afraid of losing influence. That's ugly fear, because ugly fear is the fear that goes down in us and causes us to do something evil towards others, to discriminate against them, or to be violent towards them. Nazi fears, ugly fear. Now, most of us, I realize, don't live in the world of ugly fear very often. At least I hope we don't. But as we consider ourselves allies for people of other religions, for LGBTQ people during Pride Month especially, for African Americans as we remember Juneteenth, we need to remember that it's the fear of well-intentioned people that often keeps them from speaking up and supporting and defending. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer cries out from his grave, that's the archenemy, that fear. The only antidote to fear, the only real antidote to fear for us, is to recognize that Jesus is in the boat with us, that Jesus is in the storm, that Jesus is the only one capable of quieting that storm. How many of you have been in a moment of terror or panic or great worry, and you prayed and said, Jesus be with me, or God save me, and you felt it get wiped out of your body immediately? How many of you have had that happen? All the OSL, oh, lots of you, good. All the OSL people, of course, have experienced it. That is how you know that that is the one great tranquilizer, the one that will work without fail. Why are you afraid? He's right here in the boat with you. Amen.